Hi all, it's Teresa in Gemma's house. Well, it's time for another quilt project. Okay, so this is the next quilt that I want to work on. And I centered the main part of the design on top of the mattress. So I think I will add 6 or 7 inches to the length, just at the bottom. And the same amount on both of the sides. On the top, I'm not going to bother adding any more because that part of the quilt just gets pushed under my pillows. And usually I just turn the quilt down at the area of the pillows anyway. And these pillows were just on my bed to match the other quilt I had on my bed earlier. And they don't match this quilt at all, of course. And this is one of my favorite quilts. I love blues. So I already bought fabric to do this project when I was at the fabric store the last time. The fabric was on sale, of course, and I got enough fabric so I could finish this project. Okay, so I had bought 2.5 yards of this fabric when I was at the fabric store last time because I had so many good coupons to use. And I'll use this for the 2 sides and the bottom to extend the dimensions of the quilt. And this quilt is directional. In the 4 corners of the main part of the design, I have this fabric that has these birds on it. And so I have to make sure that they're facing in the correct direction and which sides of the quilt get the new borders. And if you watched my other 2 videos of how to make existing quilts bigger, the one video, the binding in that quilt was used as a color break between the quilt and the new border. And in the other video, the binding did not show when I added the new border to the quilt. And as I'm looking at the design of this quilt, there aren't any squares that have a color band in between them, except for this part, and that is part of the center design of the quilt. So I'll just sew the new border onto the binding, and the binding will actually be inside the seam. So it won't show except for the other side of the quilt. And in that other video, that method, the binding didn't even show on the other side of the quilt. So you might want to check that out. It is a different method than what I'm doing on this quilt. Okay, so just some quick math here to figure out if I have enough fabric for the borders for 3 sides of the quilt. My fabric, I have it doubled, and it's measuring 44 inches in length. So double that, that's 88 inches. So I have the quilt folded so it will fit on top of the table. And measuring the length of the quilt, it's 39 inches. So double that, that's 78 inches long. So each side will need a border that is 78 inches long. And the fabric is 88 inches long, so that will be plenty. And I'm going to cut the borders to be 8 inches high, so I'll just cut an 8-inch wide strip along the fabric. And since it's doubled, that will give me the 2 borders, one for each side of the quilt. So measuring along the bottom of the quilt, it comes to 39 inches. So double that to get the entire width of the quilt. That's 78 inches. But I also have to keep in mind that when I add the borders on the 2 sides, that's extending the border that I have to have on the bottom. So since I'm cutting the borders to be 8 inches wide, I'll add 8 inches plus 8 inches for both of the sides, plus 1 more inch. 78 inches for the width of the quilt. plus 17 inches, and that equals 95 inches. And on the back of this sheet, I'm pretty sure I had used an unbleached cotton muslin. But I have this piece of unbleached muslin from my stash, so I'll just cut the same number of strips as I did from the blue fabric, and this will be the backing for the borders. Okay, so I'm ready to sew the backing onto the borders for the sides. Okay, so since I won't be adding a binding to these finished edges of the borders, I wanted to make sure that when I'm ironing these, that the backing isn't showing on the front. Okay, so now I'm ready to insert some cotton batting in here so that this is the same thickness as the rest of the quilt. And I don't want to put the batting all the way to the edge. I want to leave about 1/2 inch here so that this seam doesn't get too thick when I sew it onto the binding of the quilt. So I'm going to cut my strips of batting, and I have some remnant pieces here of cotton batting. I'm going to cut them to about 7 inches wide. And I'm just laying the strips of batting in between the blue fabric and the backing. And I had to piece some of these, so I just used a zigzag stitch on my machine. And I'm just using some of my curved quilting pins to pin this together. And then I'm going to quilt it with just straight lines across. Okay, so now it's time to sew the borders onto the sides of the quilt. And I just checked the direction of the quilt, and this is the top of the quilt here. So I have the finished side of the first border at the top, and with right sides together, I'm just going to pin this all the way down and then sew it so that the entire binding of the quilt is inside the seam. So that will have to be about 1/2 inch seam. Okay, after I pinned the border onto the first side of the quilt, I realized that I also need a finished edge down on this side of the border too. Because when I sew the bottom border on, I need all of these edges to be finished. Okay, I just finished sewing the border onto the first side of the quilt, and I hand sewed the unfinished edge of the bottom of the border to make a finished edge. So now I'm going to iron this flat, and then I'll top stitch right along the outside edge of the binding, and that will keep everything nice and flat. Okay, so here's the first border sewn on to the one side of the quilt, and as you can see, this is where I stitched along the binding on the other side of the quilt. So it looks nice and neat on this side. Okay, so I just have to do the exact same thing for the border on the other side of the quilt, and then I can move on to the border on the bottom of the quilt. Okay, so I just sewed the bottom border on, and I did it the same way as when I did the side borders. And I quilted it with straight lines already. And when I was sewing the backing to the blue fabric, I finished the one edge. But I left this side open. So now I'm just going to cut this batting It's about 2 inches. And now I'm going to trim this about 1/2 inch from the side border. And I'll turn both of these edges in and hand sew it to create a finished edge on this side of the border, like this. And then I'll top stitch. And as one last step, I'm going to top stitch all the way around the 3 borders that I added, about 1/2 inch away from the edge, kind of to simulate a binding. And I'm using a variegated blue thread in the top thread and an off-white thread in the bobbin. And then I did one more row of top stitching all the way around, about the same distance away from the first top stitching, just to make sure that the edge of the batting was caught in the top stitching all the way around the quilt. Okay, so now I have all this fabric left over. I can make some pillow shams out of this to match this quilt. And it's finished. And it covers my entire mattress now, so I'm really happy about that. So hopefully this video gave you some ideas of projects you can do in your own home. And can I also ask you to check my main Gemma's House channel page, because I do a lot of other projects besides quilting, and if you click on the videos tab, you can scroll through the videos and maybe there's another video you'd be interested in watching as well. So thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate the viewer support. Bye-bye.